What I'd like to fundamentally discuss today is the union of Matan Torah. And fundamentally, if somebody goes over to you and says, how do I know that the Rebbeinu Shalom exists? And how do I know that the Torah is of divine origin? The only real answer that you can give, really, and substantially, is the fact that I have this as a Masorah, as a tradition, from the time of Matan Torah. This is really the answer for anyone that comes over and says to you, how do I know these things are true? And we will see later on why this can only really be the answer itself. And what I'd like to explain today is, why is this an answer? What is the nature of this? Is it a sufficient answer? And why should it really tell us the kind of, at least give us the feeling of certitude that the Torah is of divine origin, and that this basically is the tachlis of what a Jew should do. Fundamentally, what is the Torah view? If you go over to an Orthodox Jew, a person who's essentially knowledgeable, and you say to him, what do you believe in? He will say basically the following. I believe that a very critical event happened about 3,200 years ago, something in the year of 1250 BCE. And that event is the background or fundamental event which changed the entire face of Jewry. What was that event? He will say the following. That event, which occurred 3,200 years ago, involved an ancient people called the Israelites, who were descended from Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob, Abraham, Yitzchak, and Yaakov. And what happened was that they were in Egypt for approximately 210 years. And then in their state in Egypt at that time, they were fundamentally, for a great many of those years, in enslavement, or in some different level of oppression. The actual enslavement itself, the Shibud of Mitzrayim, the hard slavery itself, didn't occur for the last 80 or so years. But fundamentally, they were in very successive different stages of oppression, or losing their liberty. And they were in this particular condition for 210 years. After 210 years, there arose among the Jews an individual, his name was Moshe, and what he did was, through the koyach that the Rebbeinu Shalom gave him, he took the Jews out of Egypt. And he took them out by resorting to supernatural events. These supernatural events fundamentally occurred in two different phases. The phases that they occurred were, one, they referred to the makas, or the plagues, that he brought on Egypt, in which to force Egypt to yield the Jews and give them their independence. And number two, they referred to the supernatural events which happened at Yam Suf, at the Red Sea, which finally destroyed the entire power of Egypt itself. And basically these were supernatural events, which Moshe was able to employ from the koyach that the Rebbeinu Shalom gave him. After this, the Jews then went, as a complete nation, they went to the mountain Har Sinai. And when they arrived at Har Sinai, they received the Torah from the Rebbeinu Shalom through Moshe as the intermediary. And Moshe revealed to them the Taryag mitzvahs, not at one time, but fundamentally over a period of time. But the Torah, which represents the will of God, in terms of the way that we are to conduct ourselves, through what's called the Taryag mitzvahs, the 630 commandments, was given to us through Moshe Rabbeinu, from the Rebbeinu Shalom, through Moshe, as the fundamental communicative vehicle, as such. And once the Jews received this, they accepted the yoke of these Taryag mitzvahs upon themselves and upon all their children until the end of time. This is what an Orthodox Jew would say. These are my beliefs. The exodus from Egypt, the final disintegration, destruction of the Egyptian forces, and the revelation at Har Sinai, the giving of the Torah itself. Very simple. Those encapsulate the three basic events that happened at that period of time. And the Orthodox Jew will say, the Torah believer will say, because of these events that occurred, I therefore follow the Torah. And I make it as the focal point of my life. That's what a Ben Torah will say, or a Yid will say. If you go over to an unorthodox Jew, unfortunately a Jew who is not from, or who is an Apikoros or a Min, whatever shade you want to call it, either he's an Amoritz or he's a Koifer Baker, however you want to call him, he will give you a very different viewpoint. And he will say the following. I hear what you're saying, he would say to the Fumiyid, but frankly I don't believe it. I don't believe it because I wasn't there. I don't know that it happened. I surely didn't experience it myself. That's number one. Number two, he will say, now that my father says it's not true, and same thing my grandfather. Maybe if you look into my roots, yes, my great-grandfather was already an Orthodox Jew. And he obviously claimed the same thing you did, you see. But I know that my immediate parents, and perhaps my grandparents, in most cases just the immediate parents, didn't believe in the same thing. So therefore, why should I believe in it? He will say another thing. Even if I grant and say what you're saying is true, that there was an exodus from Egypt, and there was some kind of event that happened at Sinai, how do I know that the way you're describing it is the way that it occurred? Perhaps Moshe was a very powerful commander, and he was a very important general, and through military warfare he was able to free the Jews by some kind of rebellion or revolt, you see. Or perhaps another series of events took place. Maybe there was some kind of cataclysmic processes or events that took place at that time, some flood or eruptions or something that happened to Egypt at that time, so that Moshe and all the Israelites were able to take advantage of the upheaval in Mitzrayim and leave, and they ran away. You see, who says that it was some kind of supernatural event that happened? That the Moshe forced power to give up the Jews by being pressured because of some supernatural event. Maybe it was a natural cause that did it. And moreover, when you see that Moshe revealed the Torah, how do I know that he got it from the Rebbeinu Shalom? Perhaps Moshe, he himself wrote it. He wrote it himself. And he gave the 613 commandments as you described, because fundamentally those commandments tell a person how to be a civilized person. They tell him how to be a mensch. You see. And therefore these laws are necessary to create the essence of an ummah or a nation. So how do I know this is of divine origin? Who's to say this? Perhaps it was written by a human being, by Moshe himself, as an incredible administrator and lawgiver, like Pericles in Athens, you see, or Hammurabi in the time of the Babylonians, you see. Finally, he'll say to you, on the basis of all these questions, why should I devote my life to a series of restrictions or a series of obligations when I don't know if these things are really true, or if they don't apply now, maybe they apply to them, you see. That's what he'll say. Why should I enter myself into the shelter or the tent of Torah when I have such important stakes or doubts about the entire validity of Torah itself? This basically constitutes the unorthodox Shita, and I happen to be saying it in maybe a better way than you mostly hear it, in certain ways. But these are the types of objections that they'll say. And on the surface, they're really very intelligent objections, you see. And the purpose that we have to understand in terms of answering these objections is not only in terms of telling him what the situation is, but in order to understand it for ourselves, you see. What is it that we really believe in? But more fundamentally, there's an even stronger question that you can ask that has nothing to do with an Afikoros. You can ask it from the Torah itself. That fundamentally the Torah itself has a profound objection to its own understanding. And what do I mean by that? Well, we said last time in the trying to understand what the importance of learning Hashkafa, we said the following: that very simply put, the fundamental purpose of every person in the world is to assess his basic value or the basic importance versus the Rebbeinu Shalom himself. And basically, each person has to go through what's called a contest. And it's a contest of will between himself and the Rebbeinu Shalom. What is that contest of wills? There are two sides to this particular argument. The first side simply says that there exists an entity who is a God, and that this God is absolute in his existence and absolute in his power, such that everything that was existed came from him in some mysterious way, and that everything which is in existence needs him to constantly maintain itself from him. So therefore, he created everything and he maintains everything. Moreover, nothing can be matzliach, nothing can affect anything in reality without his will. You see, In other words, the Bnei Shalom, the koyach of the Bnei Shalom exists, number one, in the fact that He is, number two, that He is the only true power, and number three, that His is the only true will, and number four, everything which goes on only goes on through His activity. You see, and we have defined this as what's called Yichud Mitzvasoi. He alone exists. Yichud Shlitaso. He alone has the power and the ability to do something. Yichud Ritzonoi. Only His will can truly exist. And number four, Yichud Hanagotzoi, which means that only He is the one who's involved in actually affecting things in reality. That only His force is what moves all time and all history, nothing else. The person must come to the idea or to the understanding of these four basic truths. And by coming to the understanding of these four basic truths, he understands what's called the Yichud HaBoreh, the absolute unity, and the absolute uniqueness of the Bnei Shalom himself. If a person realizes that, he automatically realizes his own importance vis-a-vis that particular understanding. That he therefore can only be understood in relative terms to that of Bnei Shalom. Therefore he must be subservient to that God, because he must come on to that God. You see. And therefore, if he is subservient in existence to that God, he must be subservient in will to that God, and he must obey the will of that God. That's fundamentally what a person should develop. He has to understand that Yediyah. And by understanding that Yediyah, he assesses his true merit and his true purpose in the world. The other side of the coin is the other Yediyah, where he says there is no God. Or else there is a God, but his function or his power is very limited and very conditional in some way. If a person believes in those premises, then he'll say, well, if there is no God, if there is one who exists in a limited way, fundamentally, the God is weak. And if God is weak, I have a koyach. I have a certain independence. What I want to do, I can do. And if I want to be matzliach, by understanding chokhmah and by understanding the nature of the reality, I can take advantage of certain forces and I can manipulate reality to do what I want. I am a free, independent, powerful spirit. True, I'm not a God. You see. Only a person who's mentally imbalanced will think that he's a God. However, I am a free and independent spirit. And therefore, I can do in life what I want to. I don't have to listen to another das. So, that itself is a certain view. So fundamentally, a person can entertain one of two views. He can either entertain the view where God is absolute, and therefore he must obey the will of that absolute being, or he can entertain the opposite view, that God is not absolute, and therefore he has a certain credence and a certain power unto himself. Now, if the person believes that God is absolute, then he sees the oneness of God. He is said to understand what's called Gilu Yechudai. If the person believes that God is not absolute, then we say that his mind or his das is in a state of what's called Hefti Yechudai, which does not see this absolute power, and this automatically resurrects his own power. In that sense. That's called a state of Hefti Yechudai, or the invisibility of the oneness or power of God, to allow him to think that he himself has a certain koyach. Now, we said last week, why did the person believe in Hester? Why? Why should a person believe that God is not absolute? So what we said importantly last week, that fundamentally the Yetzer Hara is able to accomplish this belief or this Chasson Yediyah in Hester Yechudai through three different devices. And they're extremely powerful devices. One, he develops this by the nature of Olam Hazeh, because the world itself is composed of physical matter, and each of us can only understand reality through the five senses. And the five senses constitute our prison. And we cannot see ruchnius. We cannot perceive God. We cannot understand or even perceive the substance called ruchnius. We can only know what our five senses tell us. So therefore, there's a hester on his metzius. We don't see God at all. We cannot understand. We do not come in perceptual contact or sensory contact with his existence. This is the first hester which exists by the very fact that we live in this world, Olam Hazeh. The second hester comes to the fact of what's called teva. When we look at the world through natural events, we see that God does not exist in natural events, because natural events seem to occur by themselves through cause and effect, self-regulatory mechanisms. When you study physics and all the sciences and so on, we see that the world seems to move by itself. And it moves in a very exact, very orderly fashion. You see. And when we say, where does a God exist? The answer is, we don't see His hand. We don't see any evidence of Him at all. We don't see any hand guiding these events. They seem to move on their own. So therefore, natural law seems to disguise the fact that the Yibbonim has a shlita in the Bria. So therefore, the chush, or the perceptual deficiency that we have disguises the Yibbonim Metzias. The fact that the world runs by itself disguises the shlita of the Yibbonim. And finally, when we experience the third type of Hester, which is the most powerful form of Hester, when a person examines his own life, and the life of his friends and acquaintances and relatives, and the life of all people in all history, he sees a very simple thing. That life essentially appears to be fundamentally chaotic, without order. A person's deeds has very little to do with what happens to him later on. He can do good things, and bad things will happen. He can do bad things, and good things will happen. He can do good things, and good things will happen, or bad things, and bad things will happen. Or he can do nothing, and bad things will happen to him. In other words, when he tries to figure out in what way his maisim or his deeds are connected with the events that happen to him, there's no apparent connection. There is no what's called, there's an absence of a certain concomitant variation. The correlation is nil, you see. Because when you build up the two, you can see that there's no predictability. You can never predict by something you do, something will happen. So this seems to indicate that there is no guiding hand behind reality. If there's no guiding hand behind reality, there's no purpose and there's no meaning. That's a tremendous hester in terms of the, not the shlita, but in terms of the hanhoga. Yichud Vitzona and Yichud Hanagosa, it says that it's only the Bonishon whose will is manifest in human history and human life. And it's only His Koyah which actually moves reality from one point to another. Where do you see this? You don't see this at all. All you see is chaos and disorder. And you not only see it, you feel it, because it produces tremendous frustration and a great deal of pain. You see, when you feel that life is not truly in your control. So fundamentally, the Yitzhak is able to accomplish the Hester of the Baruch through these three ways. There's the Hester of Chush, or sensation, which disguises the Baruch existence. There's the Hester which exists in natural law and Teva, which disguises the Baruch Shlita. And then there's the Hester which exists, what's called Mikra, or the Hester which exists in the human experience itself, which disguises the Baruch actual interaction with human life at every point in time. These three Hester, Chush, Teva, and Mikra, you see, are the three fundamental forces and powers that the Yitzhak can convince you that there is no Baruch or that he's very limited. That's a chason, therefore, in your das. Once you have a chason in your das, which is his main focus, suddenly you'll say, if there is no God in that kind of sense, then I can do what I can want. So you will run after Olam Hazeh. That's it. You can do what you want in that sense. Now the question is, these three things are very powerful, and they exist in every person's life. What is the counteraction to this? What does the Yitzhak Tov have to do? How does the Yitzhak Tov able to produce a state of Gili Chudai? It would seem that the weapons of the Yitzhak are so powerful. Where does the Yitzhak Tov have his weapons? Okay, the answer is that the weapon of the Yitzhak Tov is Torah itself. By studying Torah, by studying its hashkafa, mainly, by trying to understand what we can know about the Metzias of the Banashon, what we can know about his will, what we can know about his hanhoga, how he moves through history, and how he moves through each person's life, we can begin to see what's called Gili Yechudai. And that information, that idea, will allow us to begin to develop the true perspective of what we are vis-a-vis in respect to him, and then we will be forced to Mekayim the Tayag Mitzvahs. This is what we said last week, why Hashkafa is so important. Because Hashkafa is the only true weapon against the weapons of the Yetzer Hara. Without it, you're lost. Without understanding the idea which is necessary to be Megali Yechudai, you're at the mercy of the Yetzer Hara to be Masti Yechudai. Because the Yetzer Hara is able to use all the weapons of reality itself. So we see therefore the fundamental importance of Torah itself. That the Torah gives us the information in which to counteract the false information which the Yetzer Hara gives us through certain of the aspects of reality itself. Once we understand this, we understand now a profound contradiction in the Torah itself. Because now we're really in trouble. If the only way we can combat the Yetzer Hara, you see, if the only way we can develop a subservience to the will of Hashem is by learning the Torah, then the question that the Torah says to us, the Kaifa, is a very profound question. He says to you, wait a minute, you're telling me that I should keep the mitzvahs because I believe in the Torah, but I question the very validity of the Torah itself. So in other words, I question the very effectiveness of the weapon that you choose. That is fundamentally what he's saying. But this is the big problem now. It's a terrible problem that we have to see ourselves. If we're relying on Torah and on the idea of Torah to combat the Yetzer Hara, you see, then the questions that the Apikoros who says, how do you know this is true, is earth-shaking for us. Because if we don't have the Torah, if we don't have the divine origin of the Torah itself to in some way give us a Gilui Das, then we're in deep trouble. Because we cannot combat the Yetzer Hara, who shows us through Chush, through Teva, through Mikra, that Yeshoid Mavadoy. You see, that you can do what you want because you are a free and independent spirit. This is really the problem. The problem is not so much what the Apikoros says, that he says, well, look, I don't believe in the Torah, I wasn't there, I don't want to keep it. Even if you believe in the Torah, it's really fundamental. Because what happens is, the Torah is extremely critical in accomplishing the fundamental purpose that a person is here. And if the Apikoros is able to marshal certain questions against this weapon, then that's the problem. So the question is that on the Torah itself, we say to the Bnei Shalom himself, this is the kasha, forget about what the Apikoros asked you. Forget about that. Go over to the Bnei Shalom himself and says, wait a minute, I am a boss of Adam, and you put me on this earth to do your will. But in order for me to do your will, I have to know something about your existence. Fine. You want to show me something about your existence, so you give me the Torah. But I question you, how do I know that this Torah is true? In other words, just like the Yetzer Hara is able to marshal weapons of Das or Yediyah against me from one side, if you want me to fight the Yetzer Hara, you have to give me the same kind of certainty and the same kind of Das against that. But I don't know that. My understanding of the Torah is based on emunah, on belief, fundamentally. My understanding of the Torah is not one of das, it's one of emunah. How can therefore emunah go against Yediyah? Yediyah is much more powerful. How can you go over and give the Yetzer Hara the koyach of Yediyah and tell me that I have to fight him that comes from the koyach of emunah? That's the question that's really the question that you ask. And that's the question that has to be asked to the Bnei Shalom himself. Now you may say, that's what the Bnei Shalom wants. The Bnei Shalom wants you to develop an emunah which can counteract the Yediyah. And I say that's ridiculous. And I say that's ridiculous for two reasons. First of all, it's ridiculous from the very nature of man. Whenever an artisan creates an object, he designs the object according to its tachlis, according to its purpose. The design of the object in some way reflects and is consistent with its purpose. Man is composed in such a way that he's a creature of reason or intellect. When we say this, it means that man can do two things. He can reason and he can understand, and he has a desire to understand and he wants to know. That's his nature. That means that man's nature, or the intellect, in some way must be involved with his purpose. You can't therefore tell me that Yetzer Hara can come over and use the nature of man, you see, to be Masti Yechudai, and then the Bnei Shalom expects man to believe in something against his das, in order to be Magali Yechudai. You see, you can't tell me that the Bnei Shalom designed man in a certain way which is contrary to his purpose and which leads to the Yetzer Hara, leads to his powers. You can't tell me that the idea of a person, you see, stands in, we call it, contributes to the power of the Yetzer Hara and contributes against the power of the Yetzer Tov. In some way, the das of the person must also contribute to the power of the Yetzer Tov itself. You see, that means that the belief in Matan Torah must be based on das, not on emunah. But the question is how. Not only that, we see something else. The Torah it says itself that the belief, that the understanding of the Messiah of the Bnei Shalom is not emunah, it's yediyah. Because it says, Ato Horeis L'das, Ki Hashem Elokim Eino Mavadoi. It says, Ato Horeis L'das. It doesn't say Ato Horeis L'hamin. The Bnei Shalom expects us to know his existence through das, through yediyah. It also says, Yodat Hayoim V'Hashem B'Yisravecha. Ki Hashemayim M'ma'al V'Ha'os M'tochas Einoim. B'yediyah, Yodat Hayoim. It doesn't say L'hamin Hayoim. The Bnei Shalom somehow expects us to understand them and believe in it, to understand the Torah through yediyah, through understanding, through reason, not through simple emunah. So those people who come over and you say that you're supposed to be mammon, I say that this is connected to Torah itself. This is connected reason itself. It is connected to Torah. So fundamentally the question is, how is this possible? How are we establishing an understanding of Torah, of Matan Torah, through Yediyah and not through Emunah? This basically is the issue. The issue is then, again, how is it possible for us to combat the Yetzer Hara, who functions through the weaponry of Yediyah, with the weaponry of Emunah? One is far inferior to the other, and it also contradicts the very nature of man himself. And we see also that the weapon of Emunah is itself not employed in the Torah. Because the Torah expects you to employ the weapon of Yediyah against the weapon of Yediyah. It's Yediyah versus Yediyah, which is the proper balance of what? Of Bechira. It's not Yediyah versus Emunah. And the Pesukim say this openly. The question is, how do we understand this? How can we understand Matan Torah in terms of Yediyah and not in terms of Emunah? Thus we see that the question of the Apikoros is not only a question that he asks us, but it's a question that we must ask of the Baruch Shem himself, what he expects from us. Fundamentally, what I mean by the Yediyah, in terms of what's in, that Emunah cannot be stronger than Yediyah. But even when we say that the Yetzer Hara is Yediyah, he doesn't have a certain Yediyah. Even if the Yetzer Tov has Yediyah versus the Yediyah of the Yetzer Hara, it's not a certain Yediyah because you must have Bechira. Yediyah both means that each side, or each view, is reasonable. And the question is, the person has to choose which side that he wants, in terms of what he wants to think of himself, what he wants to be. That's what we mean. However, what fundamentally is needed is some kind of Yediyah. And what we find is that the Yetzer Hara has an excellent das, he has an excellent argument in terms of Chush, Teva, and Mikra, and the Yetzer Tov has no argument fundamentally except for Torah. But Torah itself, fundamentally, where does it come from? How do we know that that's true? How do we know that Matan Torah is true? So that also presents an equivalent strength of Das. But in neither case, in the idea of either case, will it be strong enough to create a certainty on either side, so that the Bechira can be manifest. The true Nesoyan Adam does not rest in Das. It represents fundamentally what he wants to think of himself. And depending on what he wants to think of himself, that will determine the kind of Yediyah or knowledge that he wants to accept in order to support that view. But the Nesoyan doesn't rest on Yediyah. The Nesoyan rests on Ratzon, on what he wants about himself. But you can't have a two Bechira unless you have two equivalent alternatives. And if you have a Yediyah in terms of the Yetzer Hara for Hester, you've got to have Yediyah for the Yetzer Tov. And we therefore say that the Torah, Matan Torah cannot be based on Emunah. It must therefore be based on Yediyah. Now, there's another thing that you might say. You might say, well, fundamentally you have to believe in Matan Torah. You have to have Emunah. But there are many things about the world which will support Matan Torah. A lot of things in terms of Chokhmah. You know, if you look at the world and you look at the Chokhmah and Teva and many things, we can believe in God from other reasons. Who made the world? Where did it come from? The regularity of Bria many times indicates that there is an intelligence. So you might say that one can prove the existence of God from the world itself. You see. In other words, the Yediyah doesn't come from the Torah itself, but the Yediyah comes from Chokhmah, from reality, understanding reality. And that, in combination with the Emunah of Torah, is enough to combat the Yediyah of the Yetzer Hara. That's a very weak argument. Because basically, there were many great Chachamim who did not believe in God, or they believed in God in a different way, as an impersonal force. For example, Aristotle or Einstein. These were very great Chachamim who were tremendous in understanding the Chokhmah of the world, yet they did not believe in the way we believe about the Baruch Shalom. So obviously Chokhmah alone will not do it. It will not do it. Also, fundamentally, if we say that it has to do with just the idea of the world, everyone is born with a different level of intelligence. You see, some people are born with mediocre intelligence, and some people are born with genius intelligence, and some people are born with very low intelligence. If the whole Emunah and Torah is based on the amount of intelligence you have, in terms of whether you can understand the existence of God from Chachma, that's impossible, because it means that the Bechira of a person depends on his level of intelligence, and that's not true. If it depended on the level of intelligence, then a person can say, after 120 years in front of the Baruch Shalom, he can say, look, you come over to me with a taina, why didn't I believe in God, and why didn't I believe in Matan Torah? I'll tell you why. Because I wasn't intelligent enough. You didn't give me enough seichel. You see. And if you tell me that you did give me enough seichel, well, there are people who had bigger seichel than me that didn't believe in you. So you can't come over and tell me that I should have believed in you, the Baruch Shem, on the basis of Chokhmah and on the basis of what I see in reality, because it's not enough. So therefore we see that this is the point. Where does the Yetzer Tov get its weaponry? He cannot get his weaponry from Amunah alone, and he cannot get his weaponry from Amunah and the observation of reality through Chokhmah. Neither of these things will be strong enough to give a person a Yediyah in the Baruch Shem in that way. So, the question is, where must this information come? And the answer is, it comes from the Torah itself, it comes from Matan Torah. That if we can understand the nature of Matan Torah itself, we will begin to understand why it's very reasonable and very understandable that this itself promotes the idea of the Gilui Yichud of the Baruch Shem himself. But the question is, how? In order to answer this question, we have to divide the question into two parts. First of all, the first thing is, why should we believe in Matan Torah since we weren't there? Okay. But the second question is, why did the Jews in Mitzrayim, the ancient Jews, our forefathers, believe in Matan Torah? Why did they believe it? What happened? Moshe came down and Moshe said that I am going to reveal to you the will of God. I am a prophet, the greatest prophet of all time, and I'm going to tell you what the Baruch Shem wants. That's called Gilui Tzonai. You see, the question that we have to ask is, why did those Jews believe in Moshe Rabbeinu? Why did they believe that what he was saying was true? How did they know he didn't write it? You see, Jews are very interesting people. They don't take anything for granted. You see, and they'll always, and in that kind of sense, that's the way they are, that's their nature. They're very fierce and they're very independent in that kind of sense. And you can be sure that all the Jews at that time would not have let Moshe Rabbeinu get away with that. No Jew will submit to anything that he doesn't really have to submit. I'm She'eref. In a certain way, that's a Maila, in that kind of sense. And no Jew at that time would have believed Moshe in that way. So if he couldn't somehow, with certainty, substantiate that what he was saying, that this Torah is the Gilui of the rocks in the Baruch Shem, that this is the Gilui of his will, that this is what the Baruch Shem wants. So the fundamental question that we have to ask is, how did those Jews know that what Moshe was saying was true? Forget about us. How do they know it? Okay. The answer that you can generally give is the following. Moshe was a Navi, and they believed him because he was a Navi. Now, fundamentally we have to look into this even more exactly. What exactly is a Navi? What is the strength that lies in prophecy? Okay. There are two kinds of knowledge. Or fundamentally, knowledge can come from two different directions. All of us have knowledge from the direction of perception. We are in contact with the outside world through sensation and through perception. From that contact, what's called a posteriori knowledge, we develop all the information that we get. We collect our information, and so on. We therefore develop understanding or information empirically by seeing what's out there in reality and by, seeing what the story is and so on. However, there's another kind of knowledge, which is not a posteriori, but rather a priori in a certain sense, that it's not based on sensation at all. And what is that based on? It is possible for a person to be a very big Yerushalayim and a very big Ovid to such an extent that he connects to a higher existential plane. He connects to a higher existential plane, meaning that what happens is he becomes aware or he becomes conscious of a deeper level of his neshama, or a certain level of his neshama which exists on a higher existential plane. Now, I'm not going to go into the details of that. That is for another shir. But fundamentally, the neshama itself comes from the Olam Ruchni. It comes from a spiritual world. And that spiritual world has many, many different planes. And each plane, or each existential point, is greater than the one beneath it, in the sense that it has greater kedusha, in the sense that it's more subtle in its substance. And the more subtle that is it in substance, then the knowledge, or the Gilui Yichudei, which corresponds to that level of substance, is greater than the one before it. It is possible when a person is Magali Yehuda a great deal in his own life to become aware or to develop a certain consciousness of information which is not gotten through the senses. That's called Ruach HaKodesh. When you hear, for example, Rebbe Tzadikim, that they know things which they could not have known. They know things, for example, in the future, or they know things that are going on right now in your own life or in other people's lives, without in any way having been able to get that information empirically. Where did they get that information from? They get this information because they're in contact with, in a certain sense, their own neshamas, to the sense that they can feel this information from a level of experience which is greater than pure sensation itself. Now, since none of us actually experience that kind of level, this fundamentally is what occurs in people who are zeicha to that madrega. What a Navi really therefore is an individual who is in such a high madrega of yira, of gil yechudai, that his neshama is very powerfully involved in his basic activities. He feels this in the sense that he is knowledgeable, or he's aware of a higher level of consciousness. He therefore feels information, and he knows things which cannot be known through normal inferential and empirical channels. That's called Nevi'us. Nevi'us, or prophecy, is in a higher madrega of Ruach HaKodesh. Both of them refer to experiential knowledge, or knowledge which is not empirical. The lowest form of knowledge, which is what we have, which is called hasaga, or logic, is based on information which we can infer through reason. A Baal Ruach Kodesh or Navi becomes aware of information by virtue of his state of being, not by virtue of his state of understanding or logic. There's a whole different way of understanding Chachma. And there are people, when they arrive at this madrega, that know information by the fact of who they are. You see, not by the fact of what they reason. I'm kind of trying to define what Nevi'us is. Now the Torah says the following, and we know this, that there are individuals who are capable of this kind of phenomena. You see. And this kind of phenomena has nothing to do with Torah in that kind of sense. There are individuals who simply know things even without any empirical evidence. And they can prove it. They can tell you things that will happen, and they can tell you information about yourself that they could never have known in any other way. And it is incredible. And there are people who have existed like this up to our times. You see. And who clearly know this kind of information. Now, most people today have not experienced this anymore. We're not in contact with these kind of people. But Jews throughout time have always been in contact with these kind of people. What I'm describing is the phenomena or the fact of a Navi. What a Navi is. He is an individual because by virtue of his higher level of Yir Shemayim is in contact with a certain existential plane which allows him to understand information which exists on that existential plane. You see. And he knows that information by just virtue of who he is. It just enters into his consciousness and he knows it. And he knows it with a certainty. It has nothing to do with the information he gathers by experimentation or observation or narration. Now, what the Bunishim says is the following, that it is another fact that the Bunishim will use this kind of an individual to Mimagala's Rotzen. Since this is a kind of person who could be aware of information which is beyond the senses, the Bunishim therefore will use this person to reveal information that he wants to reveal to mankind. You see. So therefore, this kind of a person, called a Navi, who has this capacity for this kind of understanding, becomes a vehicle or an intermediary to convey information that the Bunishim wants to give to other people who don't have access to this kind of information. That therefore is a function of a Navi. Now a Navi also will know information that he doesn't reveal to anyone else. When a Navi or this kind of a person becomes aware of this kind of information, a lot of this information he simply knows on his own. He doesn't tell this to anybody. It's for his own benefit. In other words, he achieves a certain level of Yir Shemayim, right? He knows certain kinds of truth, certain kinds of emes, and certain kinds of soidus, and he doesn't tell anybody about it. But there are certain kinds of information that he does become aware of, that the Bunishim says, I tell you, go and tell this to other people. The Navi then has a tzivoy to reveal this information. But the Bunishim is only mitzvah him because he has the capacity to know this information in the first place. Now the Torah says that it is a mitzvah's essay to listen to this person. If a person comes and he says, I am a Navi, and he says, Koyam Hashem, that the Bunishim said, you must do the following, you see, we are mechuyev to believe in him. We must believe in him. If we don't believe in him, we are all chayav misa b'dei shemayim. In other words, if the Navi is commanded to do something, and he refuses to do it, he himself is chayav misa b'dei shemayim. Like Yonah. Yonah was commanded to go to Nineveh, and tell the people of Nineveh to do certain things. He refused to do it. Yonah was chayav misa b'dei shemayim. A Navi who does not listen to his own sivoy is chayav misa b'dei shemayim. Other people who are supposed to listen to the tzivoy of the Navi, who don't listen to him, Also chayav mistabdei shemayim. This is the obligation that the Torah says. Now, you can ask a fundamental question. Nevi'us is fundamentally a subjective experience. When a guy says, I am a Navi, and I have this experience, that's fine, as far as you're concerned, you see. But how do I know that you have this, How do I know this? If you convince yourself that you have had this kind of information, all and well. Therefore, you are obviously obligated to listen to this information. So you're chayav misabdei shemayim. You see. But you can't give me misabdei shemayim because I don't know if you're saying this true. I don't know that you're a Navi. So, what the Torah says is that you do not have to listen to any Navi unless he goes through a certification process. He must be certified, you see, and he must be registered as a Navi. Because the truth of the matter is, why should we believe him? Since Nevi'us, you see, is a subjective experience, we don't have to listen to someone else who has a subjective experience. So the Torah says you must listen to him. But you only have to listen to those Nevi'im who you have first certified. How do you certify a Navi? You see, you don't certify him by going down to the New York State Board of Certification for Prophets, because there is no such place. You have to certify him a different way. The Torah says that you have to certify him through two means. You have to certify him, one, through his reputation or his background. That a person like that must have had a background of being a very big Kaddish, a very holy man. That's number one. Number two, even if he's a Kaddish, it doesn't mean anything. He has to do something else. He has to demonstrate his Nevi'us. How? He has to be able to predict the future several different times. How many times? 2, 3, 4, 5, half a dozen times, and that's all. And he has to predict what will happen down to the last detail. And if he predicts what happens down to the last detail several times, then he is certified a Navi. If he misses in one detail, he's a Navi Sheker. That's what the Torah says. So obviously the certification process of a Navi is very stringent. It's not that poshut. You see. This is fundamentally, therefore, what we must go through. Now, you don't have to certify a Navi by making him do some big miracles. You don't have to go over to a person and say, look, I don't believe you're a Navi. If you want to prove to me a Navi, I want you to predict the following things. Tell me what's going to happen the next year, or what's going to happen in this situation, and so on. And if he's able to predict it a whole bunch of times, that sounds good. But then you can say to him, look, I still don't believe you. I want you to go split the Red Sea again. That's ridiculous. Such an assertion we don't have to give him. It is sufficient to test his ability a number of times. After we've tested his ability a number of times, and he has the background of a Kaddish, we then say, you are a Navi. Once we know the Bezdin says that he's a Navi, we are mechuyev to listen to him. If we don't listen to him, we are we're chayav misabdei shemayim. That's fundamentally how the process goes.
Where do we know the certificate?
That was Moshe.
Now, even if a Navi is certified, the truth of the matter is he still could be a Navi Sheker. Why? Because it is a fundamental fact among people who are very, very chachamim that you can know a great deal about the future through other means besides prophecy. And one of the means that you can know through other ways is not ESP, because that's a very low form, but you can know through kishuf, or the manipulation of certain koiches of tumah, certain koiches of ra, or koiches of witchcraft that were known then. We don't know these koiches anymore, but it was known then. And it is possible for people who knew these koiches to also be able to predict the future and to do things which are mamash nisim. They could also do moisim, which you saw in Egypt. In Egypt, the chachamim of Egypt were able to do the first 4 makas themselves. You see, they could have done dam tzvadeh kinim and all. They could have done it themselves. They didn't need Moshe to do it. It was the 4th one they finally said, etzpala kinim, we can't do it. The koich kishuf does not allow us to go beyond that. You see, only the first 3. Okay, so fundamentally, even if we certify a Navi, how do we know that he's not using koich kishuf? Even now. What? No, that's a whole different thing. The answer is, the way we know it is that we don't know it. But we must believe in that. Why? Because the Bereshim says the following, look, you're people, you're an Adam. You therefore must believe up to a certain point. You've got to certify the man, but you're not malachim. You cannot know fundamentally what is in his heart. And the Bereshim says the following. What the Bereshim says is the following. Is that if this man has a proper background, and he's able to do these different things about predicting the future, then you're mechuyev to believe in him. You see. You cannot know if he's using kishuf and so on, because every Jew has a cheskes kashrus. You see, every Yid fundamentally has what's called a chesed kashrus. And the Banishim says, you must rely on this chesed kashrus, that every person fundamentally is basically honest. You see, you cannot not know the absolute truth. And I say to you that as long as you've certified up to that point, then you're mechuyev to believe in him. And if he still winds up to be a Navi Sheker, I'll take the matter into my own hands. Now we find the exact same case by Edom. For example, when two Edom come in front of a court and they say, Reuven killed Shimon, right? And they examine the witnesses and the story holds out. What does the Bezdin do? They kill Reuven, right? Because he's a Rotzeach. Now, you may say, well, how do we know that these Edom are true? There's only two guys and maybe they're lying. How could we believe two people to kill actually a person like Reuven? How do we know this? Because the Torah says, I tell you to do this. In other words, the Torah says that you could never know ultimately the truth and falsity of a thing because you're not God. But the Torah says that I will take the responsibility from here. If two Edom come in front of you and they report certain events and they're able to be certified as true witnesses, you see, then you are mechuyev to believe them and you are allowed to kill the Rotzeach on their words. Because these two Edom have a cheskes kashrus. That's why. If it comes out that they're false, then the Banishim says, I will deal with them. But we're only human, and we have to deal in human terms. Since we're not God and we don't have access, since we are not God and we don't have access to absolute knowledge, only relative knowledge, there's got to come a point in time when we believe Edom, when we believe a Navi, after close examination. It is also, it is forbidden for us to accept Edom or a Navi without any examination. That would be foolhardy, you see. But once we've examined the situation thoroughly, then even though we cannot know ultimately what the truth is, it is suffice to believe in what the situation and then do it. And if Chas v'Shalom, this Navi turned out to be a Navi Sheker, the Banishim does not hold the people at fault. But he takes it out on the Navi himself. You see? In that kind of sense. Now, once we understand the concept of a Navi, what the fact of a Navi is, his ability, what his function is, his ability, the fact that he's able to access himself to information beyond the senses, his function, the fact that the Banishim uses him to convey information to Klal Yisrael, and also the concept of the obligation to listen to him, and the certification, the Chura, maybe that's why the Jews listened to Moshe Rabbeinu. Because obviously maybe he was certified as a Navi, and therefore he was able to come over and say, you know, what he did. The answer is no, that's not possible. Because the whole concept of a Navi, and the fact that we have to listen to a Navi, comes from the Torah itself, which is after the fact. You see, how do we know that we're supposed to listen to a Navi? How do we know? Even with certification. Only because the Torah tells us to. It's a mitzvah essay. That's why. But our fundamental question is, how do we know that the Torah is true? These people were coming to Moshe Rabbeinu and saying to him, look, how do we know that what you're telling us is the will of Hashem? How do we know that your Torah is the gilui of his Ratzon? How do we know that? So Moshe can say the reason is because there's a mitzvah essay, the Baruch Hashem commanded. That's begging the question. That's a circular reasoning. You know what I mean? If I can't prove something to you from that which I'm trying to prove, you see. So therefore, Klal Yisrael could not have believed in Moshe Rabbeinu because he was a Navi. Because there was no vehicle at that point. Or there was no obligation to Klal Yisrael to listen to a Navi at that point in time. You see what I'm saying? So therefore, we cannot say that that was the reason. And the truth is, it wasn't the reason. Moshe could not go to Klal Yisrael and say, you must believe in the Torah that this is the word of God because I am a Navi and I've received it. You see, Klal Yisrael would not be mechuyev to listen to him at all, whatsoever. So, the question comes back. Why did those Jews believe in Moshe? We go back to the original questions. What forced the Jews in those times to believe in Moshe Rabbeinu? And why did they feel that the Torah was of divine origin? The reason why we say the possibility that maybe the Jews believed in Moshe because he was a Navi is because of a very critical thing. And this is very important. Moshe was a very unique individual. What do I mean? Moshe was a prophet. Now, the truth of the matter is there were other prophets that were in Israel. Abraham Yitzchak was also Nevi'im. And there was Sarah and Rivka and so on. They were also the Nevi'im, prophetess also and so on. And there were other prophets as well. Moshe was very different in a certain way. Moshe had access to information that no Navi had ever accessed before. That's really what it means. When we say that what does it mean? It means that Moshe was the greatest prophet. Why? Because Moshe simply had access to an existential plane, to a level of ruchnius which no one ever after him ever had. And even the Mashiach will not have access to that plane through Nevi'us, only through Chokhmah. It's interesting that he remains supreme even in the Torah Mashiach himself, but not Chokhmah. The Mashiach are greater than Chokhmah. Basically, what happened over there by Yetzias Mitzrayim or Matan Torah was really two things. All the Jews had experienced an incredible event. They saw tremendous moisture in front of them. What they saw was the 10 plagues, the 10 makas in Egypt, and they saw that by Kriya Samsuf. What they therefore saw was a level of Gilu Yehuda which they'd never seen before, no one had really ever seen before. Why? After the fourth makkah, for the first 3 makkahs, the Egyptians in Egypt, the Egyptian magicians themselves, the first Etzbel Kim is the fourth one. Huh? By the first 2 makkahs, could have been done by the Egyptians themselves, which means that the Jews, there was no Gil Yechudai. All the Jews simply saw in the first 2 makkahs was the fact that Mitzrayim was tremendous Mechashefim. That's all they saw. And the fact that Moshe did it and the Mitzrayim did it was no indication of a Gil Yechudai at all. By the 3rd makkah, Kinim, and they realized that this could only be done by the Bonisham, they realized then for the first time that the Bonisham exists. They saw it. They realized 2 things, or really 3 things. From all the makkahs, from number 3 and on, and Kriya Samsuf, they realized all 3 aspects of Gil Yechudai. First of all, that there exists the Baruch Shalom, that even though in perception, sensation-wise, we cannot see his Metzias, but obviously from everything that was going on, they saw that he existed. For example, through the Amud Eish, they saw, they didn't see the Ruchnias, but they could see all the manifestations. They saw the Gil of the Metzias of the Baruch Shalom, number 1. Number 2, they saw what's called Gilu Shlitosai. They saw that what was Teva? Natural law is nothing more than the Ratzon Hashem. And when he wants to subvert it, he can subvert it. Because suddenly they saw all kinds of nisim that were happening that were supernatural events. So they saw clearly Gilu Shlitosai. And finally they saw Gilu Hanogotsai. That fundamentally, what was the Banishim doing? The Banishim was taking them out of Egypt to bring them to a different land. So they saw that the Banishim interacts in human history itself. That he's not a God that remains aloof from history or aloof from the experience, the human life of mankind, but that everything which happens in the life of a person happens for a certain tachlis, and that the events of history themselves moves because of the Baruch Shalom. So in other words, the 10 makas and Kriya Samsuf clearly show them Yichud Mitziasai, his existence, Yichud Shlitasai, his absolute control of Teva, and Yichud Hanagotsai, that he himself is the one who moves all of human history. So when they got out of Mitzrayim and they saw Kriya Samsuf, they saw clearly Gilu Yechudai. That was clear. They didn't see that from Moshe Rabbeinu. They saw that from everything that's happened. They saw all these Mosim, Vayaminu B'Hashem Moshe Abdoi. They saw the Metzias of the Morisham. Perceptually, and from a sensation. When they went to the mountain, and they came to Har Sinai, and Moshe brought down the Torah, and Moshe said that this is the Bonisham's will, what he was trying to do was saying, this is Gilu Etzonai. I'm going to reveal his will. So the Jews said to him, how do we know this is will? We have, by the virtue of our experience, because of the fact that we've seen all these Mosim, we know Gilu Yechudai. We know Gilu Mitziatai. We don't know Gilu Etzonai. You're coming down to tell us this? How do we know that this is his will? How do we know that you didn't write this? And that the Bonishur is mitzvah of these things. You see. Now, they didn't believe Moshe Rabbeinu because of the Torah, because he used a Navi, like we said before. Fundamentally, the reason why they believed that the Torah was Min Hashem is for the same reason that they believed that the Bonishim existed. They believed that the Bonishim existed mitrich experience. Nobody told them that God existed. Nobody told them that God moves human history. They saw, they experienced it directly. They knew that the Torah was the Yivotzin Hashem because they experienced it too. What happened was the first 2 mitzvahs of the Torah were experienced by every Jew, every adult male in Klal Yisrael himself personally in his own Nevi'us. That's what happened. Moshe didn't experience. Moshe heard the first 2 commandments. You see, he heard the first 2 commandments of the Aseret HaDibros. But not only he heard it, everyone heard it. Everyone heard it individually. What happened was suddenly all of Klal Yisrael became Nevi'im. That's fundamentally what happened. So they all experienced the first 2 commandments, which means that they the Gilu Ratzon of the Torah itself, that is divinely origin, because they all went through a process of Nevi'us. However, their Nevi'us was different than Moshe. When Moshe experienced the first two commandments, he heard the Rebbeinu Shalom talking to him, so to speak, through prophecy. He connected himself with that plane of existence, and he actually felt the communication of the Rebbeinu Shalom. They didn't experience it with that power. What they happened with their Nevi'us, they heard God talking to Moshe. You see, in other words, their Nevi'us was such that the Rebbeinu Shalom didn't talk to them and say, I command all of you. They experienced in a way where they heard the voice talking to Moshe. You see, which means that it was more indirect. Why? Because they didn't have the power of Moshe. They weren't that great prophets. For them to have experienced the first two mitzvahs like Moshe means that they would have been as great as Moshe. And that's impossible. That never was. But they had enough Nevi'us to hear the ruchnistical thing happening, so they, in a certain sense, were witnesses to that event. What do we see from this? We see a very important thing. That the understanding, the Gilu of Metzias of the Rebbeinu Shalom was experienced, and that the Gilu of the Ratzon of the Rebbeinu Shalom through the Torah was also experienced. One was experienced through the perception of the Motzim, and the other one, the Torah, was experienced by the fact of Nevuah, that everyone heard the Nevuah. Thus, that's how Klal Yisrael knew that what Moshe was saying was correct, and that Moshe was an Emes Navi. How did they know? They knew that he was an Emes Navi because they heard God talking to him. So they knew. They believed in Moshe because they believed in themselves. They believed in their own experience. So therefore they knew that the experience of Moshe was true. That's fundamentally what really happened over that point. So therefore, after the first two mitzvahs, they weren't able to listen anymore. They didn't have the capacity. But they knew that every other mitzvah after that followed the same potency. And they knew that the entire Torah came from the Rebbeinu Shalom. They knew that Moshe did not write it, but that he was being Megala what the Rebbeinu Shalom was telling him, because they heard what the Rebbeinu Shalom was telling him. It's the same mashal, for example, let's say you see a certain event, you see, and somebody came over and say to you, how do you know that this event occurred? So you say, I know this event occurred because I saw it. And let's say two other people come over and say, we saw this event. You don't have to rely on the testimony of these two other witnesses that it occurred. You know it occurred because you also saw it. It's the same thing. The understanding, the knowledge that those Jews had that the Torah was divine, the Gilu Ratzon, was because they experienced it themselves. They didn't need Moshe to tell them that it was the divine origin. Every Jew knew that himself. And therefore, every Jew therefore knew that Moshe was a true Navi. Objectively, they didn't have to certify Moshe. You see, normally after the Torah was given, we have to now certify a Navi. You didn't have to certify Moshe because every Jew knew that what he said was true because they experienced the same thing. They no more had to certify him than they had to certify themselves. That's where the fundamental emunah of those Jews came from. They believed in Gilu Metzias because of the Mosim. They believed in Gilu Ratzon, that the Torah is his Ratzon Haborei, because of the experiences themselves. This is how they knew. They knew about the Rebbeinu Shalom, they knew the Hashem, they knew the Rebbeinu Shalom, and they knew his Ratzon because they experienced the entire thing. They didn't figure it out by logic. They didn't infer it through Chokhmah. You see, they weren't told about it by somebody else. They saw it and they experienced it. That fundamentally is what happened in the Dor HaMidbar. That's why the Torah itself says that the Torah says itself that any Navi who arises later on and attempts to subvert the mitzvahs is a Navi Sheker. Why? Because the answer is that's the thing. The greatest Navi was Moshe. And that's the greatest certification because all Klal Yisrael experienced it with Moshe, you see. That's why once the Torah said that any Navi who comes after that can no longer subvert that, it obviously must be a Navi Sheker. Because you can never certify any Navi after that greater than the original certification. You see. We say that if another Navi comes after that and says, I'm greater than Moshe, you see. And I say that the Torah was changed. So they say to us, prove it. So he says, I'll prove it by telling us what he called it. I will tell you what he called it. I will predict this event and that event. They say, look, we don't care what you do. The point is, whatever you say, whatever you do cannot be greater than we will with the fact that every Jew in that nation at that time experienced the Nevi'us itself. There's no greater certification. Why? Because the certification at that time was totally objective. You see, every person felt the experience of Nevi'us. No certification was necessary. Now, you say that you're a Navi. Well, you say that you're a Navi, that's a subjective experience. So therefore, the truth of the matter is, no matter what you do, we can never truly know if you're really a Navi. Because we can never truly feel what you're feeling. You see? So therefore, whatever you say must always remain suspect up to a certain point in time. It's as simple as that. We always must rely on the chesed kashrus, you see. But with Moshe, there was no chesed kashrus at all. There was no suffix, because every Jew experienced what he experienced as well. That's why the Nevi'us of Moshe is the supreme Nevi'us, and no Navi after Moshe can ever contradict what he said. This fundamentally explains how they knew what was going on, how they knew that there was a Bnei Shalom, and how they knew, what do you call it, that there was a Torah. But mark you a very important thing. You notice a very interesting thing. At that point in time, 31 years ago, the Bnei Shalom wanted, the Hashgacha said, that I want to reveal my existence and my Ratzon in a way that I have never done since the beginning of the world. That's what the Bnei Shalom said. But when I do it, I'm going to do it in such a way which respects the nature of man. Well, what is the nature of man? The nature of man is based on yediyah. Is based on sensation and yediyah. So the Bnei Shalom said, if I want to establish my das, my belief, my principles in the mind of these people, I must do it in a way which is absolutely true. You see? Which means, and the Bnei Shalom said that the only way that I can do that is by allowing them to experience everything. Because experience is the greatest proof of all. Experience is greater than just proving something by logic, or just hearing something from another chochm by chokhmah. And that's what the Bnei Shalom did. The Hashgacha, which desired to reveal the emes of the Metzias Hashem and His Ratzon, utilized the vehicle of experience. And it's that vehicle which is the greatest vehicle to prove the validity of this kind of thing. So that's how they knew it. Now, but fundamentally the question is, how do we know it? Now, there is another very critical fact which is important also. Not only did the Bnei Shalom establish his das, or his belief, through yediyah, in a sense of experience for those people, but he established it in a way which is very unique. He established it to an entire nation. You see, to an entire nation. All the Jews that went out of Egypt, they all saw the Moifsim. You see, they all saw it. When they came to Mount Torah, the Bnei Shalom didn't megala through Nevi'us a couple of Jews. Let's say he chose 10 Jews, and he said, you 10 Jews are going to experience the first 2 commandments, and everyone else has to sit around and believe in it. You know what I mean? He didn't choose one individual, Moshe, or a group of individuals, you know what I mean? Or a tribe to do it. What the Bnei Shalom said is, I will allow all of Klal Yisrael, every adult male in Klal Yisrael, to experience this thing. So therefore, just like the Exodus from Egypt was a national experience, which is Gilui Mitziyasoi, I will also say that the Gilui Mitziyasoi will become a national experience, so that every adult male will experience it as well. So here we see the important thing. Gilui Mitziyasoi was experienced by every person in Klal Yisrael, and Gilui Mitziyasoi was experienced by everyone in Klal Yisrael. Gilui Mitziyasoi was experienced through sensation, through Moifsim, and Gilui Mitziyasoi was experienced through Nevi'us. But both were experienced by everyone in Klal Yisrael, meaning every adult in Klal Yisrael, every adult man as such. The Nevi'us occurred to everyone. That means an incredible thing. It shows you, therefore, a very important thing, that the belief in the Metzias Hashem and in the Torah is a national experience. It's first of all an experience, because it happened to everyone, it happened as an experience, and it is a national experience. It happened to the entire nation. Why? Because if it would have opened out to a couple of individuals, the whole problem of certification arises. Just like they could have gone at the motion and said, how do we know that you didn't write the Torah? They can go over to these 10 people. How do I know that you 10 people didn't write the Torah? You see, as long as the Gilui Mitziyasoi is restricted to a certain number of individuals, it always remains suspect. But if it's experienced by the entire nation, it cannot remain suspect. It's something which is indisputable and evident to everyone. To the entire nation, that is. The next fundamental question is, how do we ourselves know that this is true? Transmission. How do we who have never experienced know that this fundamentally is true? What happened was that Moshe took the experience of the Nebuah, of the entire mitzvah, the entire Torah, and he wrote it down in a book. That book is the Torah itself. Now that book contains 2 things. That book contains all the Tayyag mitzvahs, so therefore it's a manual. It's a manual of what the mitzvahs are and what a Jew is supposed to do. But Moshe did something else with that book. He wrote out the entire account of what happened. He wrote down the entire, in Shmos, he wrote down the entire account from the Exodus of Egypt, all the Makkos, Kriyas Samsuf, and the entire incident of Mount Torah. So therefore the entire account of what happened to the entire nation is also written down in Torah. And he gave a copy of this fundamentally to every household member. Every person got the Torah Shabbat and so on. And Moshe said, you all have this Torah, you all have the Torah Shabbat fundamentally, and this Torah Shabbat basically serves two functions. It serves the function of a manual in terms of what to do, and it also it's a record or an account. It's a record of an account of what happened. Now each father then took the book and said to his son, look, you all experienced Matan Torah, or whatever the story is, and you know that it all happened in that kind of sense, and that everything that happened in this thing is true. Now, this was the first generation, and in the first generation, the Dor Midbar, it was clear that everything that happened was true. What about the next generation, the one following the Dor Midbar? What each father said to his son was the following: you weren't there, you never saw these things, but I'm telling you that I saw these things. I saw all the things that happened, and I experienced the Nevuah. And not only I experienced, but every Jew outside, the entire nation experienced this. And whatever is written in this book, this account, which is written in this book, is true, because I personally was involved in that. So the son said, well, how do I know this is true? So the man said the following: if you don't believe me, go and ask every other Jewish family. You see. So the son went out, and he went to another family, down the block, that he didn't know, and he said, excuse me, did you experience these things? So the man said, yes, I experienced these things. So what the son saw was an amazing thing, that because of the fact that this was a national experience, there were 600,000 independent traditions. You see, in other words, each father said, I experienced this. And if you don't believe me, ask another father. Each one corroborated on his own. Now, when that son therefore passed it on to the next generation, what happened? He said, look, I've never experienced the stuff in this Sefer. I don't know about these things because I was never there. However, my father told me, you see, that he experienced these things. And that third son would say, well, how do I know that your father wasn't lying? How do I know my grandfather wasn't a shakran? So he would say, you don't believe me? Go out and ask all the other, people. So they would go out and they would say to another person of the third generation, they say, did you ever hear such a story? And they would say, yes, I received the exact same tradition from my father, and so on. So if he would check around, he would see that there were 600,000 separate and independent traditions or corroborations of the same event. So he would realize, obviously, if all our Zaydas put down this particular tradition, obviously it happened. Even if my grandfather was a liar, you see, even if he was a liar, that doesn't mean that your grandfather was a liar or your grandfather. The very fact that there seems to be 600,000 different traditions, each one independent of each other, means that it must have happened. You see what I'm saying? This fundamentally is the force of the tradition. Because what it is the following: since this experience occurred to the entire nation, to every household member of the nation, what it means is that the events were then transmitted to each household member separately. So every family started its own tradition. But what happened is that tradition that it started was an independent one that had nothing to do with the other. Everyone said that what happened in this Torah is true because of the fact that his deity experienced. You see what I'm saying? And because of that fact, the corroboration was immense. Because each separate tradition reinforced and corroborated the other. You cannot have 600,000 separate traditions, which is basically what you have, of an event which is essentially false because one man made it up. You see, one man can lie about himself, but he can't lie about another 600,000 people. That's impossible. And 600,000 people will not corroborate what one man lies as such. This is the power of the tradition. You see, fundamentally the following thing: if a tradition is passed down of something that occurred to a million people or an entire nation, in order for that to be true, it means that all the people in that nation must have heard about that tradition. If Moshe Rabbeinu had written the Torah and written about the entire account, and that account had been false, it would be impossible for that account to be accepted by an entire nation. You see, you can't do that. For example, like the Revolutionary War. None of us were there in the Revolutionary War. How do we know that it happened? No living person ever experienced that particular situation of George Washington or the Revolutionary War. The reason why we know it happened is basically the following: because all Americans, at least the ones of the 13 colonies, all received a separate tradition that such an event took place. Why? Because it took place to the entire nation. Something that takes place to an entire nation creates a national tradition, which means it creates hundreds and hundreds of thousands of separate traditions. And that can be corroborated simply by seeing all these separate traditions. That's how we know. We all know the Revolutionary War took place because every American knows it, because every American knows fundamentally from what the books are, but the books fundamentally say what all the people knew at that time. You can't create a myth of the Revolutionary War because it involved too many people. You can create a myth of something that happened to one person or a group of people, but you cannot create a myth of something that happens to hundreds of thousands or millions of people. You cannot do that, because something which happens to so many people creates millions of different traditions, and that's its force. If there are millions of different traditions, it means it must have been. And that's why the Bereshit was totally on that time. That's why the Bereshit was Megalas Rotskin and it was Megalas Metzias to Klal Yisrael as a nation, and not a bunch of individuals, because it would have the force of numerous separate, multiple traditions by themselves, each one reinforcing each other. Now you see the power of this tradition in the following, because this tradition has never been contradicted. In the beginning, when Christianity first started, you see, and they created a new religion, they didn't come up and make their own religion from nowhere. They based their religion on the religion of the Jews. Why? Because the power of that tradition, which is constantly enforced by all the families in Israel, separately, in the sense that every forefather passed down the tradition to all his descendants, that this happened to him, you see, and that what it says in the Torah is absolutely true, in terms of a million different verifications. This fact was so powerful that even the Christians had to accept it, and the beginning Christians were the first Jews, but even the Goyim had to accept it. None of the Goyim said that what happened to your forefathers was false. The Goyim at that time believed that what happened to the Jews are true because it was a national tradition. You see, just like the Romans knew that they came from the Etruscans, just like all the Romans who lived at a certain point in time knew that there was someone called Julius Caesar, and there was someone called Augustus, and so on and so forth. How did they know? Because it was a national tradition. Many people knew about history, and these things are passed down to all the households. They also knew that that's what the Jews experienced was also true. You see, that's why the Goyim, even when they created a new religion, they weren't able to create a new religion. They had to rely on the religion of the Jews. But what they said was the following, that even though God originally chose you Jews as the house of Israel, you Jews have been countermanded, in a sense substituted, but that God now, they could not come over, they can only say that the supplanted Jews, they're substituted, alternatives. They could not come over and say that the Jews are false, and that there was no Torah, there was no Moshe, there was no Taryag mitzvahs, none of this. They had to accept the fundamental philosophy or ideas at the time, but attempt to say that we are now the true Jews. God has revoked His covenant with you, and He's made a new one with us. That was the best that they can do. It's the same thing with Islam and Muhammad. When Muhammad created a new tradition, he could not go and say that the tradition of the Jews are wrong, or the traditions of the Christians are wrong as such. He simply could say that Jesus was a prophet, Moses was a prophet, but I am the ultimate prophet, Muhammad says, and only I now, Islam, takes over what they once had. Why? Because the tradition of the Jews was so powerful, since it was national, it could not be refuted. So it can only be built upon, but not negated. But therein lies the difference in the power. When Muhammad or Jesus comes over to the Jews and says, believe in us, you see, forget about what the Torah says. Fundamentally, they say that they're Nevi'im. So we say, fine, if you're a Navi, you see, okay, let's certify you. They cannot be certified. They can't be certified because they cannot withstand the rigorous test of certification. And even so, even if they did, what they're saying is fundamentally is that the Torah is no longer true, but that the Torah has been changed. So the Jew says, you say that? How do we know that? You're one man that comes and says that you had your own individual prophetic experience with God. You say you talk to God. Fine, maybe that's true, you see. But whatever the story is, God could not have told you these things. Why? Because we have a tradition, you see, that the Torah can never be changed. And that was told to Moshe. And Moshe's validity comes from all Klal Yisrael itself, which comes from the very national tradition itself. All we have to use is a subjective experience. We don't know if God talked to you or not, but we know that the Bereshit spoke to Moshe because he spoke to all Klal Yisrael. And we know that happened because we have 600,000 independent traditions corresponding to every one of our forefathers that such a thing happened. That's far more powerful than what you're saying. Therefore, what you're saying must be false. We find that the power of the tradition is also important in another way. Why? Because it's an interesting thing. We find that even the Jews who went against Moshe Rabbeinu, for example, the Jews, the Tzedukim and the Koroim later on, what did they say? There arose a sect in Israel called the Tzedukim, which they rose in the time of the Tanoim, and they said that we believe in the Torah Shabbat, but not in the Torah Shabbat Peh. In other words, we deny the ability of the Chachomim to interpret the Torah, but we zikha believe in the validity of Torah itself. And later on in medieval times, there was another sect that was similar called the Koroim. Even the Jews that attempted to rebel against the Torah accepted the validity of the Torah Shabbat. Why? Because it was a clear-cut tradition. The only thing that they attempted to defy was the rabbinic tradition. But the rabbinic tradition was not a national experience. You see, it was not perceptual and it was not prophetic. So therefore they were able to go against the rabbinic tradition, but they could not go against the Messiah of Har Sinai itself. You see, but it shows you the power of the tradition of Matan Torah. Because even the Jews that wanted to rebel against it could not go against the Torah Shabbat. They can only go against the Torah Shabbat Peh. And you find a very interesting thing, that until the 17th century, no group in Israel has ever arisen that said that Matan Torah was false and that the Torah was not divine. You will never find a group of Jews or movement that ever said this, which is an incredible thing. The 17th century fundamentally was 3,000 years after Matan Torah. And for 3,000 years from Matan Torah until the 1700s, right? You will never find a group of Jews or a movement of Jews that said that Matan Torah was false and that Moshe was not a Navi and he wrote the Torah. Now isn't that strange? That's an amazing thing. Why? Because that is the power of a tradition which has national roots and which is based on experience. No other religion in the world has that kind of power at all. Every other religion in the world is only based on an experience of a specific person, on of one individual who say that he talked to God, in that sense. And the verse or prophecy is a subjective experience. Nobody accepts that. We don't, anyone else, unless it's certified. But what happened in Mitzrayim and by Matan Torah needs no certification, because it happened experientially and to everybody. That is the basic difference. And therefore you find that that tradition of Matan Torah was believed by all the Jews fundamentally until the 17th century, when the Haskalah started with the Reform movement and so on. They were the first ones to break away with that particular kind of tradition itself. Now, what about the people who live today? What about the Jews who are not from and say, look, I don't have such a tradition because my father wasn't from and my grandfather wasn't from. So how do I know that this is true? You see, the answer that you have to say to him is following. It is true. You do not have such a tradition. But that doesn't mean that it doesn't exist such a tradition in Klal Yisrael. The fact that you don't have such a tradition is only 200 years old. That's all. But there was a firm tradition in Klal Yisrael for the first 3,000 years. And if the matter was false, such a tradition would never have lasted so long. That's number one. Number two, even if your father doesn't have such a tradition, even if this is true, there are millions of Jews today who do still believe in such a tradition. You see, where did they get it from? Because they say that their parents gave it to them, and so on, midor achador. Which means that if you look at the situation, there are millions of Jews who still have that kind of tradition. So there is no excuse for you to say this. If a person is fried and he's not from and he says, how do I know these things happen? You see, you will say to him, these things happen because they happen to an entire nation and they were experienced by an entire nation. If he says to you, but I don't have such a tradition, you see, then you say to him, no, you do have such a tradition. You don't have a tradition in the last couple of generations, but you have such a tradition for the first 3,000 years of your family did carry such a tradition. That you do have. And if you investigate, if you understand what the meaning of that is, if you understand that a tradition cannot go on for 3,000 years among an entire nation, for millions of people, separately and independently, unless it truly occurred to an entire nation, then you will realize that even though your tradition was broken off right now, you are still connected to the tradition in the sense that there was a point among your fathers and grandfathers that did hold that. And most of the Jews today did have such a tradition in their grandfathers or great-grandfathers. Very rare will you find a Jew today that is Zayda or his Zayda's father, you see, the father of Zayda was not from. You see, so no one has that excuse that he doesn't have such a tradition today. It's as simple as that. It's just some rationalization. This tradition is as powerful as every tradition in history. The fact that Alexander the Great existed. How do we know that Alexander the Great existed? Or the Peloponnesian War? Or for example, all the different events of history. We know them because they were passed down from generation to generation. How do we know that Europe experienced the bubonic plague in the 1400s, or the 1500s, or whatever it was, the 1300s? How do we know that? 2/3 of Europe was wiped out. Nobody was there that saw that, because such an event happened to so many people. It was passed down to all the families that remained in Europe, and they passed it down, and every family knew it. Every such experience cannot be controverted if it's upheld by many people. The fact that there are millions of Jews who exist now, and that there were millions and millions of Jews existed for 3,000 years, who all maintain that that Torah is true, and that what in that Torah was experienced by their forefathers and their ancestors by a separate tradition, shows that such an event must have happened. Because such a thing cannot be created or falsified in that way. Does any Jew today who says that he doesn't want to believe in it, once he's presented with this kind of information, it means he doesn't want to believe in it because it's rotten. He wants to pursue a way of life, or he wants to do certain things that are inconsistent with the Torah. He doesn't want to submit himself to the yoke of the Torah. So now he'll say, look, I don't believe in such a thing because I wasn't there. But that's a very weak argument. Because the truth of the matter is, the fact, the reason, or the understanding, the das, which is behind the concept of Matan Torah, is substantial. It is so substantial that it has never been refuted before the last couple of 100 years, and it was accepted by many, many groups and so on. That kind of thing says that it is very reasonable that such a thing truly did happen. And the fact that you aren't there doesn't mean anything. And the fact that your father didn't have it also doesn't mean anything. And if the person wants to believe, he wants to accept the Omach Shemayim, he wants to see the true relationship between himself and the Bnei Shalom, he doesn't want to feel the independence and rebuke or overlook what the Bnei Shalom says, he will accept that kind of logic. So the Yetzer Torah then has a very substantial argument. Even though the Yetzer Torah comes along and says, look, you don't see God, the natural events don't reveal God, and your life doesn't reveal any order, the Yetzer Torah says, but wait a minute. It was once upon a time where all these things did exist. You see, that the entire nation of the Jews experienced the perception of God in that sense, indirectly in that sense. They experienced the fact that the Bnei Shalom was behind Teva, and they experienced that the Bnei Shalom was in history and in the life of every person. And they experienced this as a nation and together, you see, and that they passed down this tradition to every Jew or every household in Klal, and we all receive it, that this Torah is true. That is the uncontrovertible fact that such a thing is true. And that's sufficient for the Yetzer Torah to say, wait a minute, this Gili Yehuda, it is sufficient. Now, it is not a certainty, you see, just like the other Yediyah of the Yetzer Torah is not a certainty. You choose now with what you want to believe. But a person cannot say that the argument of the Yetzer Torah is very weak and insubstantial. That cannot be said, because it is very substantial. The tradition, the national tradition of Matan Torah is as substantial as the Revolutionary War, as every major event or fact of human history itself, as the Roman Empire, as the Greek Empire, as the ancient Egyptians. It is as substantial as every one of these things, and it has the same power and the same force. You choose not to receive it, or you choose not to accept it, you do so not because it's not true or because it's not reasonable, you choose so because you don't want to accept it, because you do not want to subserve your life or submit to the kind of life that the Torah would prescribe and would want. And that fundamentally is because you want to believe in yourself in a way which goes against what the Bnei Shalom says. You want to believe in yourself in a value and with an importance which is more than what you are and more than what you deserve. And this is fundamentally what I think can be explained to any individual who basically wants to know this information. And to those individuals who the Hashgacha brings to you, you see, and which you can bring this kind of an understanding, those people will enter a new Pasha of Bechira, fundamentally, and they will have a whole different level of Watson in terms of that.